Hi everyone, welcome to the 9-week lecture. We're going to be focusing on the media scan. So this week continues our focus on the environmental scan, and what we're going to do now is talk more specifically about one component of the environmental scan, which we teased a bit in last week's lecture, and that's the media analysis. In this week's lecture, we're going to focus on a number of different things relating to the media analysis. The first being an exploration of the differences between media tracking and media analysis. We're then going to look at the importance of media analysis, as well as some of the key metrics that are used to analyze media coverage. We're also going to demonstrate how this type of analysis can inform campaign strategy and development. And then lastly, we're going to talk about how you can present a media analysis in an actionable format. So one of the first things I want to talk about today is the key difference between what is tracking media coverage versus actually analyzing this coverage. And sometimes people get these two things confused, but really when we're talking about tracking coverage, it's simply the mechanisms that you use to collect media coverage. And there's a number of services that are available to help you do that. These are typically what we call clipping vendors, and they can be used to collect all types of different clips, those from print or online or broadcast. And I've listed a couple here. Burrell's, Lucci, and Critical Mentions are two of the big ones. Burrell's helps you with print, and Critical Mention is helpful for broadcast, so your radio and your TV clips. In contrast, analyzing media coverage is really about what you do with that coverage after you've collected it. And what I want to spend the majority of our lecture today speaking about is how you can analyze this coverage rather than just collect it. And I will provide some tips and tools for collecting coverage, but for the most part, that aspect is fairly straightforward. If you're not using a clipping service, then really what you have at your disposal are things like Google News, general internet searches. You could use Factiva or Lexis in some cases if you have access to that, or if you have access to other databases for specific trade publications or whatnot, you can use that as well. So why is analyzing media coverage so important? One of the biggest things is that, really anyone can go out and hire a vendor to track clips or even collect those clips on their own. But what's really going to set you apart as a communicator and a practitioner is to be able to look at that coverage in relation to your client's objective and their strategy and provide some thoughtful analysis of that coverage. That's really the value in the analysis itself. So in other words, what you're doing is you're going beyond just quantification of coverage and answering that question of what does it actually mean. And one of the key components of this is to look at metrics that go beyond just volume of coverage. And we're going to talk more specifically in some subsequent slides about what some of those other metrics are. But just so you have those in mind, we're talking here about the tone of the coverage. The other really powerful part about media analysis is that it helps us to understand the likelihood of our target audience to actually be exposed to our intended messages. So as we look across different outlets, we can get a better sense for if the messages that we want for these folks to receive are actually being perpetuated by those specific outlets. And then finally, what it allows us to do is refine and adjust our media relations strategy over time, because we're able to learn from the analysis about where there are some gaps in terms of whether or not our messages are getting through, or if they're being relayed by the media in the most accurate way possible. So how do we go about conducting one of these media analyses? The first questions you're going to want to ask yourself are what's in and what's out. And this is something that's important to work closely with your client on, because they're going to have a good sense for where they're currently getting pickup in the types of outlets. So the first thing is to consider which types of channels you want to focus on, whether it be print, online, radio, TV. If your client tells you that they're not doing anything on radio, then you may not need to track radio at all. Or if they tell you that digital is really important to them, you might want to consider expanding the types of channels that you're looking at in that space to include something like social media. But this will certainly all depend on the information that you get from your client. The other thing to consider are the outlets. So a lot of times clients are most interested in mainstream publications, but again, they may have specific trade publications that they're interested in also collecting information on, or where they feel like, they're concentrating a lot of their earned media efforts. So it's important to have that conversation with them as well. Just kind of keep in mind when you are setting out these parameters that as you change them over time, it will impact your analysis. So if you can make your client aware of that and the fact that determining which publications and the types of channels you want to be tracking from the beginning and being consistent in that respect will keep your methodology sound, that's an important thing, an important message to relay to them. The other thing to keep in mind when you're considering which channels and outlets to look at is your key target audience. So if you don't have a good understanding of your audience, it's going to be hard to know where they're going for information. And you don't want to necessarily be tracking coverage if it's not necessarily likely to reach your target audience. So you would, in this case, rely very strongly on the audience profile that you hopefully have already developed if you were working on an actual campaign to determine where you should be looking to analyze coverage from. Another thing to consider is the amount of coverage. So for certain clients, we may be tracking a specific issue or topic that's fairly esoteric, and so there's not going to be a ton of pickup. But for others, it might be something that's incredibly high volume, and so you're going to want to, in those cases, potentially recommend coming up with a representative selection depending on the volume of coverage for a particular client or an issue. I would recommend, if you're working with a client where they have a very high volume of coverage, to try to work with a media analysis vendor because it can be pretty unwieldy if you're trying to collect all of this coverage as well as analyze it all on your own. So if you're collecting this coverage on your own, you're going to want to consider the system that you have in place to collect those clips. A couple of things to keep in mind as you are doing this. Some of the key inputs that you're going to want to have would be the source of the coverage. So you're going to want to note where this clip actually came from. Is it an article, let's say in the New York Times, or a blog post on the Huffington Post, or maybe it's a television appearance on CNN. Whatever it may be, you're going to want to keep track of that. Then you're going to want to take a look at the type of source, so whether that's a print or an online or TV or radio. And then you're going to want to look at the number of impressions. And so what I mean by an impression is what you're going to see here in this purple box. And that's a metric that we use to track the number of people who may have seen an article, heard something on the radio, or in a podcast, or watched something on television, or read something on a web page or blog. So what we're talking about here is really reach of that particular media channel and outlet in terms of the likelihood that it would actually be seen, heard, or read. And I'll talk a bit more about some of the places that you can go to find out the impression numbers for the various outlets that you're looking at in the next couple slides. And then the last thing I would want to mention in terms of the things that you would note as you're collecting coverage would be the tone of that coverage. So is that particular mention of your client something that is negative? Is it positive? Is it neutral? You'll just want to note that as you're going through as well. All right, so I said we weren't going to spend too much time on collection of media, but I did want to just give you guys a quick overview of some of the places you can go when you're looking for those impression numbers that clients so often ask for. So if you're looking at a print channel, let's say your New York Times, your Wall Street Journal, whatever it may be, the metric that you're looking at is circulation. And typically you can find this through Cision, which oftentimes agencies have a paid membership or subscription to. You can also oftentimes just find it looking at the particular publication's website or in the print publication itself. And then if you're using some sort of clipping service, they'll be providing those impression numbers for you. With broadcast, so if you have TV or a radio mention and you want to get a sense for the impressions there, the key metric that people often talk about is the reach. So how many eyes or ears are on that particular mention. And Oftentimes we use TVI or critical mentions to track this type of broadcast coverage, and they can provide you with the reach numbers. If you're not using one of those two sources, then you can usually track it down by reaching out directly to the TV or radio station. And then finally, with online, what we're really looking at is audience. And there's a number of places that you can find online impressions. Again, if you're using a clipping service of some sort, they'll be able to provide that to you. Compete is a really good website for looking for that kind of information as well. So we spent quite a bit of time so far just talking about how you even go about collecting media coverage and clips. And what I think is the more interesting part of this lecture is actually how you then go about analyzing. And that's really where your assignment this week is going to be focused. So let's talk a bit about some of the steps that you would take when you're actually conducting your analysis. One of the first things that you're going to want to do is determine what your key search terms are and what key messages you might want to be tracking, if any. And what this does is it ensures that as you are tracking coverage, you're only pulling coverage that's going to be most relevant to your campaign objective. So your search term should really ladder up to what is it that you're, the question that you're looking to answer, the challenge you're looking to overcome. Those search terms should be relevant to that. The next thing you're going to want to do is a baseline analysis. So this would be before your campaign actually starts. You can get a sense for what the current landscape is looking like. This helps you not only to get a sense for what's going on now, but it also helps you to show how you move the dial with your efforts. If you start your analysis midway through your campaign, it's going to be hard to prove to your client that what you've done has had significant impact, positive impact on the overall campaign. The other thing you're going to want to do with your client is to define your metrics. So what are the key metrics that you're using to evaluate coverage? And this is something that I'm going to talk a bit more about in subsequent slides. We're going to drill down into each one of these. But some of the ones that we use are volume, placement, tone, key message penetration, and share of voice. So let's talk a bit more about that conversation you would have with a client when discussing the types of metrics you would use as part of your media analysis. I can bet you that they're probably going to want to focus very heavily on volume of coverage. That's the thing that most clients are concerned about. And that's not a bad thing. It's good to track volume, but it's also good to be mindful of the fact and to let them know that that shouldn't be the only metric that they use as part of their analysis. When in fact you can get a lot more nuanced and richer understanding of how you're doing in the media by looking at a host of other metrics. A couple of the more meaningful ones that we try to track I've included below here. So the first being placement. The point being that, impressions don't mean a whole lot if your coverage is buried within a specific outlet or featured someplace obscure or irrelevant to your intended audience. So it's important to note where in a particular outlet that mention is taking place. So in other words, the front page of the New York Times is going to be a lot more impactful than, say, the middle page of some sort of regional newspaper. Another thing to be mindful of is tone. A lot of people might argue that there's no such thing as bad publicity, but I can tell you that, when you're dealing with some pretty sensitive topic matters and subject matters, especially when it comes to crisis communications, the tone of that coverage really, really matters. So here we're going to look at things like positive, neutral, or negative to define the tone. You also want to consider the degree to which your key messages are breaking through. Getting picked up by the media is really only half the battle. The other part is ensuring that the messages that you're most interested in your target audience receiving are actually the ones that are being communicated by the media. And this is particularly important when you're looking at analyzing the efficacy of, let's say, a spokesperson. This will help you understand if, what they're saying, if the messaging that you've told them to communicate is really being relayed by them, or if the media is picking up these messages. So what we're talking about here is really the difference between mentions and real message saturation. And then another one you want to think about is share of voice. And this is something that you would consider when you're looking at your client vis-a-vis their key competitors. And here, what you're looking for, and I would say what clients are most interested in is whether or not they're really dominating discussion on a given topic. And if they're dominating that discussion compared to their competitors. So are they winning when it comes to a specific day, week, or month? That's something that comes up a lot as well. One caveat on the metrics that we talked about so far is that they are very focused on traditional media. So when you're looking at social media, there are going to be some other metrics that you might need to consider. One is the shareability, or the number of times a particular article is being shared in the social space. You could look at things like retweets or likes on Facebook. You're also going to want to look at the influence. So this is particularly useful if you are tracking, let's say, some type of spokesperson. So how many followers do they have, or friends on Facebook, or connections on LinkedIn? These things will help you get a sense for their overall influence in the space that you're looking at and on a particular topic that you're interested in. And there are some tools that you can use to get a better sense for how to track social media metrics. One of the ones that we use most often when just looking at blogs is Technorati. I mentioned Compete earlier. Google Social Analytics is also really helpful, as well as Facebook Insights. Oftentimes what we do when analyzing social media coverage is enlist the help of a service known as Radian6, and they're able to collect coverage as well as provide some analysis of it. And this can be really helpful because there's such a huge volume in the social space, as well as a lot of sort of things that don't necessarily matter. It can be hard to parse through that manually, so having a service help you to do that has an algorithm in place can be hugely helpful. So let's talk a bit about how we're going to present this analysis to our clients. One thing I want to mention here is that conducting a media analysis is typically hugely useful for clients, and one that they find really fascinating, but it's also something that results in a lot of questions from them, because what you're talking about here is how they're being talked about and represented in the media. So in some ways it's sort of something that they take a bit personally. So in that way, knowing your methodology and being able to articulate it to them is going to be very helpful in backing up all of the findings that you present. So this would start with being able to clearly define and convey each of the core metrics that you are using. And this is something that hopefully, if you've established at the outset of the analysis, won't be too laborious as you're presenting it, because you would have already agreed upon which metrics you want to look at. The other thing you want to be able to articulate to them is the rationale for why you chose those metrics and why they're important to track. You also want to be able to give them a sense for what the representative selection is that you chose. So more specifically, what are the sources that you considered and how many of them were included as part of your analysis. And then finally, you want to be able to give them a sense of the time frame that you were looking at. So are you looking at a campaign that spanned 6 months, a year, 2 years, whatever it may be? You want to be able to show them that you are tracking the specific efforts that you've made over time versus something that feels a little bit more arbitrary. Now, a lot of this is going to be very easy if you have a clear sense of what the objectives of the analysis are. For clients, media strategies really differ. For some of them, it's just about getting as many impressions as they can, and they don't really necessarily care that much about where those placements take place. Some other clients might be very concerned with just getting a few hits in some very targeted publications. Let's say if they have a very specialized audience, it might be 2 to 3 trade pubs that they're most interested in getting coverage within. But regardless of any of this, the main thing to kind of keep in mind is that you want to define your objectives as part of your presentation, so that as you're going through it, everyone is clear as to how success is being measured and why it's being measured in that way. Now, I know we've talked about this already, but one of the things to consider as you're presenting your analysis is the importance of having diverse metrics to present, because what oftentimes happens is if we're only measuring ourselves in terms of volume of coverage or number of impressions, we're setting ourselves up to potentially fail. So as you're presenting your analysis, it's really nice to have some diverse metrics to fall back on, and to also just tell the full story of the progress that you've made beyond just the sheer amount of coverage. Another thing to focus on is why the analysis matters. And I know this is something that we've covered in previous lectures, and it's important here as well, because if we're not really showing our clients why these findings actually matter to them and what the key implications are, then it's not going to really feel all that useful to them. It needs to be brought to life. So some of the things that you might want to call out as you are relaying some of those key implications from your analysis would be a discussion of which of the key messages are breaking through and which are not. So that gives them a sense for the tweaks that need to be made in their messaging. You also want to be able to describe to them some of the inaccuracies that may be perpetuated by the media, specific to their brand or their message or their particular issue. And then you can propose there a way in which that could be corrected. So does that mean that you are going to change the types of reporters or editors or outlets that you want to reach out to? Maybe it's a tweaking of those messages themselves. Maybe there's something that's unclear about the way that you're talking about it that's somehow getting confused within the media space. You'll want to be able to discuss with them if their key influencers or spokespeople are really capturing enough of the conversation. If they're not really breaking through, maybe it's time to consider a different spokesperson or a different way of training that person. You also will want to look at how your client is comparing to their key competitors. Are we doing what we need to do to achieve more parity moving forward? Or are they really eclipsing us when it comes to media coverage, and what do we need to do to change that? And then finally, you're going to want to look at how you're doing as compared to your baseline. So if before your efforts were in place, you were seeing a certain volume of coverage, how has that changed post your efforts? Or was the tone in coverage, has that changed? There are a lot of different metrics that you can look at there that we've already talked about, but it's nice to be able to give a comparison of how things are moving given the efforts that you have. So now I'm going to walk you through an example of a media analysis that I covered, and this is going to be at a pretty high level, but I thought it might be helpful to put it into some real-world terms to bring it to life a little bit more. So some background on this client: they represent a group of companies that market and sell a particular insurance product called a fixed indexed annuity. And they had some concerns about how these products were being portrayed in the media, and they had some concerns about how that portrayal might be impacting their overall sales. So what we set out to do in our media analysis was to get a better understanding of A, the amount of coverage, and B, the tone of that coverage. And actually, there was another thing that we were looking at too, which was, if the tone was negative, what were those messages that were being perpetuated by the media? So we would have some understanding of what we needed to do to change the course. So from a methodological perspective, we looked at top 15 mainstream publications, and I made a point to narrow this down because I knew that I was going to have to code these articles myself and collect them myself rather than using a clipping service. We just didn't have the budget. So, that kind of set me up to feel like I could do it without getting completely overwhelmed. So looking at those top 15 mainstream publications, and really what we were focusing on there were those publications that had a section on personal finance. So we were looking at publications like Forbes and Fortune and the Wall Street Journal, rather than, let's say, a People magazine or something of that nature that was a little bit more lifestyle focused, but might be considered a top publication overall. And we also looked at some key trade publications, and I made a point of Also limiting those to the 5 to 10 major trade publications where we were seeing discussion around the product taking place. And then I analyzed the coverage by both the impressions and the tone. So for each particular outlet, I recorded the impressions, and then I coded the articles, reading them and noting where there were specific mentions of the product. Was it a positive, neutral, or negative mention? Now, if there was an article where there were maybe a couple positive mentions and then a couple negative mentions, I would, if they were represented in equal numbers, I would mark it as neutral. Now, if there were more positive than negative mentions in a particular article, I would mark it as positive. And then if there were more negative mentions, then I would mark it as negative. And so what I found after looking across all this coverage was that the messaging that we had been working to achieve through our campaign efforts, specific to the product itself and some of its key attributes, were positive. So when talking about some of the benefits of the product, we were really effective in that way. The media was picking up those messages and perpetuating them. Where we were seeing our strategy fall down a bit was with regard to the way in which these products were being sold. So there were a lot of stories that we found out there that were talking about sales agents or producers selling these types of products in unethical ways, and in some cases even preying upon older Americans. And so what that told us is that we had a real issue in terms of that message, and we needed to figure out a way to show consumers as well as the media that there were some real standards and guidelines in place for how these products were being sold. And so a few bad actors shouldn't necessarily be tainting the product's reputation as a whole. So what you can get a sense of here is just the fact that doing something as simple as a media analysis, you really do get a sense for how well your campaign is performing, as well as how you can take your messages and even tweak them slightly or emphasize certain points to really impact the way that your target audience and the media are portraying them moving forward. So then on this next slide, what you can see is just an example of how I actually broke out the way that I tracked this coverage. So you can see what I did here is I have a reporter category, I have the publication, the number of articles, the total impressions, the net tone, and then the messages that were being communicated. So this gave my client a snapshot of what I was tracking and the inputs that I used to conduct my analysis. Now, for this particular client, tracking the reporter was very important because as part of our media relations strategy, we were pitching specific reporters. And so it was important for us to understand those reporters where the stories that they were writing were predominantly neutral or negative. That way we could, in the future, target them and think about how we could get them to see the story from a little bit of a different perspective. We also wanted to know, the messages that they were specifically communicating so we could refute those when we felt like they were incorrect. And so what you can see there in that last column is that a lot of the positive messaging was really around the specific product benefits themselves. And then when we saw some negative mentions, it was more about the ways in which those products were being marketed and sold. So even just this little analysis where we were looking, like I said, at 15 publications and a few trades, we were really able to understand a lot about how we needed to change our messaging strategy moving forward. So that's it for our lecture this week. I do want to just make some notes about this week's assignment. Obviously, you're going to be provided with the scenario that you used in week 4 as your topic to focus on, but this is not going to be a team assignment. So as you're conducting your media scan and analysis, you'll be doing this on an individual basis. And I would just urge you to take a look back at this week's assignment to get more of the specific details on what you will need to include in your analysis. I do want to note here that we did spend some time talking about impressions in this lecture, but that's not going to be something that I'm going to ask you to specifically report on as part of your media analysis. I don't want this to be a lesson in how to collect or find impressions. I'd much rather have you focus on looking at the content of these particular articles and how they could potentially impact your campaign moving forward. And then lastly, feel free to note any questions or observations that you might have relating to this week's lecture by posting those in the questions and observations forum.